Chapter 1. Jalalabad, Afghanistan. The 4 dead men were lined up on the living room floor of the safe house. Mitch Rapp started with the one on the left. The bearded face, the dark, lifeless eyes, and the dime-sized bullet hole that marked the center of the man's forehead were all expected. 1 bullet, nice and neat, the way Rapp would have done it. The next 2 bodyguards looked the same, including red pucker marks in the center of their brows. The 4th Afghani was a different story. He'd been shot through the back of the head. A quarter of his face was now a jagged crater of flesh, blood, and bone. The exit wound told him the man had been shot by something a lot bigger than a 9mm, probably a .45 caliber with ammunition that pancaked and tumbled for maximum damage. There was nothing about this mess to give Rapp any assurance that things would be fine, but this last little twist cracked open the door on something he didn't want to consider. Rapp set the troubling thought aside for a second, tried to imagine how it had gone down. The early signs pointed toward a well-coordinated assault. The perimeter security had been breached. Phone line, cameras, motion sensors, heat sensors, and even the pressure pads had all been taken offline. The backup connection through the satellite dish on the roof had also been disabled. Whoever had attacked the safe house had the knowledge and skill to hit the place without setting off a single alarm and alerting the quick reaction force less than a mile away at the airbase. According to the experts at Langley, this was never supposed to happen. 4 years earlier, they had claimed the safe house was impregnable against any threat that the Taliban or any other local group could come up with. Rapp had told those same experts that they were full of shit. He'd never seen an impregnable safe house for the simple reason that people had to come and go. As with most CIA safe houses, this one was intentionally bland. There was no American flag flown out front, and there were no snappy Marines standing post at the main gate. This was a black site where the more unpleasant aspects of the war had been coordinated. Langley didn't want any official records of the comings and goings of the drug dealers, warlords, arms dealers, local politicians, police, and Afghan army officers who were on the take. The house looked like your run-of-the-mill 2-story block house in Jalalabad. There were quite a few upgrades that made it unique, but from the outside, it looked dingy and run down just like all the other houses in the neighborhood. The cinder block wall that surrounded the property was coated with a special resin designed to prevent it from exploding into a million pieces and shredding the house in the event of a car bomb. The simple-looking front door contained a 1-inch steel plate and a reinforced steel frame. All of the windows were bulletproof plexiglass, and the high-tech security cameras and sensors were concealed so as not to attract the attention of the neighbors. Langley had even taken the unusual precaution of buying the houses on each side and moving in the bodyguards and their families, all to protect one man. Joe Rickman was the most cunning and brilliant operative Rapp had ever worked with. They'd known each other for 16 years. At first, Rapp didn't know what to think of him. Rickman was pure vanilla. There wasn't a single physical characteristic about him that was memorable. At 5'10", he was neither tall nor short. His mousy brown hair matched his dull brown eyes, and his weak chin completed the bland lines of his roundish face. On the rare occasion that you heard him speak, he was never animated, and his voice was pure monotone, the kind of thing that could put the most restless baby to sleep. Rickman's forgettable face allowed him to blend in, and those who met him were almost underwhelmed by his presence. For Rickman, that was just fine. Much of his success was built on fools underestimating him. He'd worked for the CIA for 23 years, and it was rumored that he had never set foot inside headquarters. Only a few months earlier, Rapp had asked him if the rumor was true. Rickman responded with a soft smile and said that he'd never been invited. At the time, Rapp took the comment as a self-deprecating attempt at a little levity. Later, he realized Rickman was dead serious. Rickman was one of those people who were tolerated only during tough times, usually war. For the last 8 years, he'd run America's clandestine war in Afghanistan. More than $1 billion in cash had passed through his hands. Most of it was used to bribe people into playing on the right team, but a fair amount of the money was used to kill enemies and for a laundry list of other unpleasant things that went with the territory. People back at Langley didn't want to know what Rickman was up to. They only wanted results, and that was something Rickman was exceedingly good at. Underneath Rickman's bland facade was a cunning mind that was perfectly suited to the duplicitous, infinitely complicated world of espionage. Rapp understood the tinge of fear in his boss's voice when she'd called him a little over 2 hours ago. When the morning guards showed up, they had discovered the bodies and the absence of Joe Rickman, and had immediately alerted John Hubbard, the CIA's Jalalabad base chief. Hubbard rang his boss in Kabul, and the shit rolled uphill from there. Rapp received a call from CIA Director Irene Kennedy while he was sitting down for breakfast in the big mess hall at Bagram Air Force Base. He had just arrived in country the previous evening on a high-priority mission that was now on hold. Kennedy passed along what little information she knew and ordered Rapp to grab the next Black Hawk to Jalalabad. Rapp didn't argue. He and 4 of his team members made the trip and were on the ground in Jalalabad before 9 in the morning. Hubbard met them with a 3 SUV convoy and a security detail, and they rode to the house. Langley would want Rickman back, but Rapp got the strange feeling that, all things considered, they would prefer the Black Ops boss delivered in a body bag. It would be impossible to keep the kidnapping a secret. Rickman's operational knowledge and reach was too vast to ignore. Entire teams would already be gathered at Langley, working around the clock to assess the damage. If Rapp didn't find Rickman quickly, then complex, expensive operations would have to be unwound, or assets would start showing up in morgues all across the Middle East, Southwest Asia, and beyond. Sooner or later, Congress would get wind of the disaster, and they would want answers. For a good number of people back at Langley, the only thing worse than Rickman spilling the company's secrets to an enemy would be Rickman testifying before Congress. Rapp had a long and somewhat complicated history with Rickman. He respected the man, but it had taken a while. Rapp was considering how he would handle a possible order to eliminate Rickman when the towering Hubbard approached. "This shit is really bad." Rapp nodded. "It's about as bad as it could get." Hubbard rubbed his bald head and asked, "How in the hell are we going to find him?" "At this point, I'm not sure." Rapp knew their chances for success were remote, but they had to start somewhere. "This is going to get really nasty. And if you don't have the stomach for it, Hub, I suggest you go back to the base and lock yourself in your office." Hubbard studied Rapp for a moment and then nodded. "You don't have to worry about me getting all sensitive on you. I've been over here for 2 years. I've seen all kinds of crazy shit." Most of that crazy shit was stuff done by the enemy. This time they would be the ones crossing the line. "I know you have," Rapp said. "But trust me, if we're going to get him back, we're going to have to be more ruthless than you can imagine, and if at any point you start to have doubts, that's fine, step aside. But I need you to promise me you'll stick your head in the sand and keep your mouth shut." Hubbard gave him a nervous smile. "I can do a Sergeant Schultz when I need to." "Good," Rapp replied, even though he had his doubts. "So, where do you want to start?" Rapp returned his attention to the row of dead men. "The bodyguards." Hubbard turned his 6'5" frame toward the row of men and pursed his lips. "I think we can rule these 4 out." Rapp focused on the man with the cratered face. An inside job was the obvious conclusion, but the bodyguards were all hardened Northern Alliance types. It was possible that one of them could have been bribed into giving up the crucial information in the security system, but unlikely. If one of them had turned, however, it was also possible that the Taliban, or whoever was responsible for this, had decided to kill the inside man as soon as they got what they wanted. The wrench in the works was that Rapp was pretty certain the Taliban had nothing to do with this. He pointed at the man missing part of his face. "Focus on this one. I want to know everything there is to know about him, especially his family. Do his parents or wife or kids have medical problems? Does he have a drug problem? Anything you can find. And the other 8? A team of interrogation experts from D.C. were in flight but not expected to land for another 13 hours. If you have the manpower, you can get started with them, but I doubt they'd hang around after something like this. What would you do if someone gave you a pile of cash to betray your buddies and a man like Rick?" Rickman's first name was Joe, but everyone who worked with him called him Rick. "I'd run." "That's right." Rapp pointed to the man who'd been shot with a .45 caliber. "Focus on this one for now. So you think the Taliban turned him?" Rapp ignored the question for the moment and asked, "Who moved these bodies?" "What do you mean?" "The bodies," Rapp said as he pointed at the row of 4. "They weren't shot here. Look at the blood on the floor. They were dragged here after they were killed." Rapp pointed at the stairs. One of them was dragged down from the second story. Hubbard shrugged. They were lined up like this when I got here. Did the bodyguards move them? Not that I know of. Do you want me to find out? In a minute. Rapp looked toward the front door, where one of the bodyguards was standing post with an AK-47 gripped in both hands. The neighbors. Did they hear or see anything last night? No, not a thing. No signs of forced entry? Not that we've discovered, but they wouldn't need to force their way in if one of these guys were helping them. So, no forced entry. 4 bodyguards, 4 headshots, 4 dead men. Anything about that seem unusual to you? Hubbard thought about it for a moment and said, Not sure what you're driving at. Rapp pointed at the bodies one after another, saying, 9mm, 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 45 caliber, and my bet is they were all fired from suppressed weapons. Pretty accurate work. Good fire discipline. Look at the walls. Hubbard did a 360-degree turn and said, What about them? You see anything? No. That's the point. You ever seen the Taliban operate like this? 4 shots, 4 hits, and not a shot more? The Taliban likes to get the lead out. You know their MO. They would have rolled up on this place with 3 or 4 trucks and started unloading RPG rounds at all 3 buildings. This place would be riddled with bullets. This was done by pros. Hubbard made a sour face and then nodded. Yeah, you're right. The towelheads like to blow shit up. This is more like something our guys would do. Hubbard kept talking, but Rapp had stopped listening. The idea that U.S. special operators had been involved was something he hadn't considered, and something he didn't want to consider. From the moment Rapp had heard Rickman was missing, there was a gnawing fear that he was about to head down the rabbit hole. Rickman excelled at his job for the simple reason that he could think 5, 10, 15, even 20 steps ahead of the enemy, and everyone else for that matter. There'd been many times when Rapp didn't understand what the man was up to because he wasn't smart enough to follow Rick's thinking. How about those assholes from the ISI? Hubbard asked. Rapp had considered the less than loyal members of the Pakistani intelligence service. They would be on the list as well as others. Don't forget the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese. And there was one other possibility that Rapp wasn't quite prepared to mention. My money's on the ISI. This is just the kind of bullshit they'd pull. A thought occurred to Rapp. Where's the dog? That big frickin' Rottweiler that never left Rick's side. Ajax, he died a month ago. Rapp was surprised by the news. What was wrong with him? Don't know. Rick was pretty bummed out, though. Dog got sick. He took him to the vet and had to put him down. I think Rick said it was cancer or something like that. One of Rapp's team members came down the stairs with a disturbed look on his face. The man had blonde hair and blue eyes and was pushing 50. Not good, was all he had to say. Rapp looked at Scott Coleman and said, Please tell me you're talking about something other than the safe. Tell me the safe is untouched and all the cash, drives, and laptop are safely tucked inside. Coleman shook his head. All gone. Completely cleaned out. Even though Rapp had expected it, he had held out some hope that he could give his boss some good news. Shit. I need to call Irene and let her know. Rapp reached for his phone, but stopped upon hearing a commotion at the front door. Chapter 2. Abdul Siraj Zahar admired himself in the mirror. At 48, he was an old man in his country. Even among the common people, it was difficult to make it to manhood. In Zahar's line of work, the challenge was much greater. He was a warrior, like his father and his father before him. His father and all 3 of his older brothers were dead. His father and the 2 oldest brothers had been killed by the Soviets, and the 3rd one had died at the hands of the Northern Alliance. Zahar had learned from their mistakes. Afghanistan was a brutal country where the only person you could really trust was someone from your own village. Beyond that, loyalties were an ever-shifting, complicated game. Zahar had learned that to stay alive he had to be brutal and vigilant. He knew that some described him as sadistic and paranoid, and he wore that as a badge of honor. The more people who feared him, the better. In Afghanistan, fear ruled. If you couldn't get men to fear you, you became a target. Zahar didn't want his life to end the way it had for his father and brothers, so he stoked the fear. It wasn't always easy, but he had found that he was good at it. Zahar pulled down on his gray uniform blouse, snapped his fingers, and then held out his arms. His aide rushed forward with Zahar's shiny black leather service belt. He buckled it around his boss's ample waist, made sure it was straight, and then stepped out of the way so Zahar could admire himself in the mirror. Zahar smiled at his reflection. His weapon was a still unfired .40 caliber Smith & Wesson. The fact that Americans had given it to him for free made ownership all that much more delicious. He'd spent most of the last decade killing Americans, and now he was on their payroll. Zahar noticed something wrong with his beard and moved closer to the mirror. His irritation was directed at a patch of gray that he had missed. He grabbed a bottle of black dye from his desk and inserted a small brush. After a few applications, the gray was gone. Zahar smiled at his fine-looking beard and placed his hands on his hips. He looked good in his uniform. It was a little tighter on the waist, but in Afghanistan his expanding middle section was a sign that he was a prosperous man. Afghanistan was a unique place. It was like a petri dish for the survival of the fittest. Historically, it had always been a harsh country. Hot summers, cold winters, and a rugged geography had shaped a breed of extremely tough people. For the last 3 decades, a state of near-constant war had only heightened the selection process. Being physically strong was no longer enough. One had to be adept at reading the ever-shifting alliances that had shaped and reshaped the power structure of the isolated country. The Soviets had to be appeased, and then the Americans and their Pakistani partners, who sponsored the crazed Wahhabi fighters from across the Persian Gulf, who in turn led to the Taliban and their enemies, the Northern Alliance, and a long civil war. Then the Americans and their coalition showed up and swept the Taliban from power in a matter of months. Abdul Siraj Zahar had been able to look into the future on that day more than a decade ago and understood that the Taliban would be back. American air power and their advanced weaponry had given him doubts along the way, but Zahar knew the Afghan people, and more important, the devout Muslims who represented the base of the Taliban. They would die to the last man before they let these godless people beat them. Zahar also knew that the Americans were too self-conscious to hunt the Taliban down like the dogs that they were and exterminate them. So Zahar played them all against each other, and never forgot the fates of his father and brothers. He held on to his little enclave southeast of Jalalabad, and changed sides as many times as he needed to survive. Zahar neither loved nor hated his country. He didn't think in those terms. He lived in this particular part of the world, like most of its people, because he had been born here. He considered himself to be an above-average intelligent person with a very good understanding of what motivated people and, more important, what they feared. Despite his ability to sense the shift in the winds of power, the most recent gigantic twist was something that even he had been unable to predict. After he had killed countless Americans and taken their money, the fools had come to him with a job offer. A legitimate job offer, not simply a bag of cash, as they had done in the past for certain information. They wanted him to become commander of the local police force. He thought it was a trap, of course, but then he learned that other lions like himself had been offered and taken similar positions in the Afghan police. It was a new push the Americans were calling the reintegration program. He had been on the job for just 6 weeks, and he was already lining his pockets with bribes from local businessmen. The Taliban was a concern, of course. They would, after all, eventually work their way back into power, but not for a few more years. And in the meantime, Zahar would play both sides against each other. He would work for the Americans, take their money, and keep the Taliban informed of what they needed to know. As always, the most important thing was to stay one step ahead of seen and unseen enemies. Zahar had long ago surrounded himself with fiercely loyal people. There wasn't a man in his inner circle whom he had known for fewer than 10 years, and they were all from his village. They were of his tribe, and in return for their loyalty, he protected their families. Zahar never spent more than 2 nights in the same place, and even with his newfound legitimacy, he continued his old ways. Part of the reason was that he had 4 wives. They all needed his attention, but it was beyond that. The axiom was extremely simple. They couldn't kill him if they couldn't find him. Nights were always the most dangerous. That was when the American killers hunted. They used their optics advantage to harass and assassinate his countrymen. For many years now, Zahir had avoided sleeping at night. He always made sure he was awake from midnight until 1 hour before sunrise. That was the preferred time that the American dogs liked to attack, so he stayed awake and on the move. He would then sleep in the mornings and conduct business in the afternoons and evenings. This morning, however, was different. After only a few hours of sleep, Pamir, one of his most trusted men, had awoken him with a startling piece of news. There was a rumor sweeping through the back alleys of Jalalabad that a notorious American had been snatched from his fortress. Mr. Rickman was a very important man who had made many of Zahir's countrymen extremely wealthy. Unfortunately, Mr. Rickman had also spent a great deal of his time and money trying to kill Zahir. There had been many close calls, but Zahir had always managed to stay one step ahead of him. Now that Zahir was in a position to finally receive some of the cash that the American was so famous for handing out, someone had grabbed him. Zahir had been silently berating himself all morning for not coming up with the plan first. With his newfound influence, it was just the type of operation he could have pulled off. Having been beaten to the prize, however, he would now be forced to adapt. If the last 30 years had taught him anything, it was that out of chaos came great opportunity, especially to those who were bold and ruthless. In the reflection in the mirror, Zahir saw Pamir enter. The man did not wear the uniform of the Afghan local police. He had always been more suited to lurking in the shadows. "What have you learned?" Pamir inclined his head slightly and said, "More Americans are at the house. I was told they flew in from Kandahar this morning and were driven to the house by the tall American." "Hubbard?" "Yes." Zahir snorted. The CIA's local man was no match for him. It would be easy to manipulate him. "Was Mr. Sickles with him?" "No." This surprised Zahir. He had found it very easy to work with Sickles. It was easy to pick up on the fact that Rickman and Sickles did not get along. Sickles had told him to stay well clear of Rickman, had told him that the man was someone he had no control over, but still Sickles was the CIA's top man in Kandahar. "These new Americans, any idea who they are?" "No," Pamir shook his head, "only that there were 6 of them." "Security?" 3 Humvees, 1 normal, 1 with a .50 caliber turret, and another with a grenade turret. "And men?" 8 total. They control each end of the street." Zahir snorted again. They would never stop his police vehicles. He would push right past them. Turning to Rashid, his lieutenant, he asked, "Are the men ready?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Have everyone get in the vehicles. I want to make a show of force." Pamir asked, "And what would you like me to do?" "Keep looking for him and report to me the second you learn anything useful." Pamir gave a slight bow and left. In his outer office, Zahir was happy to see more than a dozen men strapping on their new bulletproof vests and checking their weapons, all courtesy of the United States of America. What a bunch of fools, he thought to himself. The Americans were going to learn a very hard lesson over the next few months. Chapter 3. A group of men in Afghan police uniforms were trying to push their way into the house. Rapp looked on with irritation as a man with an oily black beard berated the CIA bodyguards. The man's beard was obviously dyed, so much so that he looked like a silent movie actor playing a pirate. To his right he heard Hubbard muttering to himself. The only thing Rapp could make out were the words, "This is not good." "Who is he?" Rapp asked. "Commander Abdul Siraj Zahir, ALP. ALP stood for Afghan Local Police. "What's his story?" "Up until 6 months ago he was an insurgent. More of a crime boss, really, extorted and kidnapped in every village between here and the border. And now, with the new reintegration program, the geniuses in Kabul have seen fit to put him in charge of the local police." The info clicked, and Rapp remembered the name. Zahir and his group were responsible for a good number of the roadside bombs in the area. Was he on Rick's payroll? "They were working on it." Hubbard motioned to the guards at the door and said, "It's all right, let him in." With obvious displeasure on his face, Zahir pushed his way past the guards and approached Hubbard, Rapp, and Coleman. He focused his attention on Hubbard and unleashed a torrent of expletives that were meant to punctuate his less-than-stellar view of Hubbard's abilities and his view in general of Americans. Rapp took a step back, his dark eyes dissecting this strange man who had so rudely forced his way into the safe house. The bombastic behavior and bluster were not entirely unexpected, but something else was. The fact that Hubbard was letting this piece of human refuse walk all over him. Rapp reminded himself that Hubbard didn't have the luxury of flying under the radar as he did. He had to report to his boss in Kabul, Darren Sickles, who was more concerned with appearances than results. Sickles had to work side by side with the alphabet soup of U.S. agencies and departments that had come up with the touchy-feely reintegration program. The consensus with the foot soldiers in the clandestine service was that Sickles didn't back them up. Rapp was willing to bet that this unhealthy and unproductive style of cooperation had something to do with Sickles. When Zahir was done berating Hubbard, he turned to Rapp and Coleman and asked, "And who in the hell are these two? Why wasn't I called about these murders?" Never one to run from a fight, Rapp squared himself so he was within striking distance of the police officer. Even though the man looked over 50, he was probably in his early 40s, like Rapp. Unlike Rapp, though, he was pudgy and out of shape. He had a little pot belly and that ridiculous shoe-polished black beard. Hubbard started to answer, but Rapp reached out and grabbed his arm. Turning his eyes on the Afghani, Rapp said, "Who I am is none of your fucking business. As to why we didn't call you, that should be obvious. You're a thug and a piece of shit." Zahir's face flushed with anger, and he began to stutter. Hubbard put up his hands and said, "Commander, what he's trying to say is that it has been a very busy morning and that we were about to call you." Rapp kept his eyes on Zahir, but directed his ire at the Jalalabad base chief. "Shut up. That's not what I was about to say. I was about to tell this little yellow turd that I know exactly who he is, and if he has half a brain, he'll get the hell out of here before I shoot him." "How dare you speak to me in such a way?" Zahir stepped back and began clutching at his big leather holster for his sidearm. From the right inside fold of his jacket, Rapp produced his Glock 19 in an easy, fluid motion. Zahir was still struggling with the flap on his holster when he looked up to find the square black frame of Rapp's gun in his face. "I want you to listen to me," Rapp said in an easy tone, "and I don't want you to say a fucking word until I'm done." Coleman had already drawn his gun, a big H&K .45 caliber, and maneuvered to cover the other two police officers who were just one step inside the doorway. The safety was already off, and he spoke to the officers in Pashto, telling them to keep their hands where he could see them. Rapp pressed the gun into Zahir's face, just under his nose. "Here's what you need to know. I'm not some State Department weenie or some two-star corporate general who thinks the best way to advance my career is to kiss your terrorist ass and get the hell out of this place so someone else can come deal with all you assholes again in 20 years. I'm the guy they call when the shit hits the fan. I'm the one they bring in to get results because they know I don't play by the rules. I know who you are. I know you've killed plenty of GIs, and you've tormented and kidnapped your fellow citizens for your own profit. You're a bully and a piece of shit, and you're the kind of guy who I actually enjoy killing. Normally I don't put a lot of thought into the people I shoot, but you fall into a special category. I figure I'd be doing the human race a favor by ending your worthless life. Add to that the fact that I'm in a really bad mood. In fact, I'm in such a shitty mood that putting a bullet in your head might be just the thing to make me feel better." Rapp studied the man for a moment, and then tilted his head toward his right shoulder as if he thought there might be some other way to deal with him. "In the interest of fairness, I suppose I should give you a chance to convince me otherwise." Zahir's chest was heaving as he struggled to get his lungs working. His eyes nervously darted between Hubbard and this crazed man sticking a gun in his face. He'd been around plenty of killers, and felt he could tell the difference between the pretenders and the men who meant what they said. This man had the look of someone who clearly meant what he said. The only lifeline that came to mind was the person who had negotiated Zahir into leaving behind his lawless ways. "Mr. Sickles is a good friend of mine," Zahir sputtered. "He is a very good friend. He is a very important man. He will be very upset when he finds out about this." Rapp's instincts were right. The Kabul station chief had put this goon in a position of power. "Darren Sickles," Rapp said, with contempt dripping from each word, "is important in his own mind, but that's about as far as it goes. He is the CIA's man here in my country. He's an idiot, and the fact that he put you in a police uniform pretty much proves the point, so you're going to have to come up with something better than Darren Sickles." Zahir licked his dry lips and struggled to find something that would make this American reconsider his vile threat. After an uncomfortably long silence, nothing had come to mind, so Zahir forced a smile on his face and retreated a step. "I think it would be best if I left." Rapp grabbed the man's uniform shirt. "That's not an option. You either come up with a way to show me you might be useful, or I'm going to blow your brains all over the floor." Zahir's eyes showed hope, and he said, "Useful? That's right. I can be extremely valuable. I'm listening. I know many people. I know many things. I can get you anything you want." Zahir's nature allowed him to go only so far, and he quickly added, "For the right price, of course." "The right price," Rapp said, amused by the comment. "I'm going to tell you how this is going to work, and that's only if you can prove to me that I should let you live. You're not going to get paid a dime. The only thing you'll get from me is your life, which I would assume is fairly important to you." "It is very important to me, but I am not a wealthy man." "Stop talking about money. You're boring me. And if you bore me enough, this negotiation will be over and you'll be dead." "Tell me what it is you want me to do. I will do anything." Rapp thought about Rickman. The truth was, very few people knew what the man was up to. In a general sense, Kennedy and a few others knew his operational orders, but in terms of specifics, Rickman had left them in the dark. Zahir might be able to pull back the curtains on some of those details. "The man who lives here. You know him?" "Mr. Rickman, very much. Yes, we were good friends." "Let's not get carried away. Why did you decide to come here this morning?" "I was driving by and I saw Mr. Hubbard's mercenaries. It looked like there was something wrong, so I stopped to investigate." "Do I look stupid, Abdul?" "No," he answered quickly. "I did not say that." "Then tell me the real reason why you stopped." Rapp watched the man fidget. He was clearly trying to figure out a way to shade the truth. Rapp's patience was nearly gone, so he took his pistol and tapped Zahir on the top of his head. "I know lying is like breathing to you." Rapp shook his head as if he were admonishing a child. "You need to fight that. It's going to get you killed." Zahir rubbed his head with his right hand. "I heard a rumor." "What kind of rumor?" "That something had happened to Mr. Rickman." "Keep going." "That something very bad happened, that he was missing." "And you learned this how?" Sharing information without getting something back was very foreign to Zahir, so he lied. "One of my men saw Mr. Hubbard leave the base in a panic. I started to make calls and soon found out that something was wrong at Mr. Rickman's house." "So, you were concerned for Mr. Rickman?" "Yes." "And that's why you showed up here, acting like a jackass and threatening people?" "No, I was concerned." Rapp glanced at his watch. It was 8 minutes past 10 in the morning, and he had a growing list of priorities that needed his immediate attention. Zahir, as disreputable as he was, might indeed have some use. Rapp made a quick decision. "Here's what we're going to do. You will work for me. You will find out who grabbed Mr. Rickman, and you've got 48 hours to come up with the answers I need. If you fail me, you're a dead man." Zahir once again tried to retreat. He needed room to think, and he couldn't do that with a gun in his face, but it did no good. The American simply followed him. Zahir's eyes pleaded for Hubbard to give him a reprieve. He didn't receive any help, so he reverted to what he knew best. "How much will you pay me?" Rapp laughed, but there was no levity in it. "I'm not going to pay you shit. In fact, I'm going to do the exact opposite. If I find out you're fucking me, I'm going to text your photo to every jerk-off with a gun in this town and on the other side of the border as well, and I'm going to put a $500,000 bounty on your head. And if you think about heading for the hills, I'll have a predator on you 24/7. If you make a call, if you step into the clear for a second, I'll shove a Hellfire missile up your ass and blow you to hell." To Zahir, the threat was all too real. He had used the CIA to decimate his own enemies by giving up their locations and phone numbers. The drone strikes were very effective. After a little consideration, Zahir realized that at least for the moment he had no choice but to go along with this man. He slowly nodded his head and said, "I will see what I can do." "If you want to live, you'll do more than that." Rapp lowered his gun and said, "Give me your phone." Zahir scrambled to retrieve the phone from the breast pocket of his blue-gray uniform shirt. He surrendered it to Rapp, who handed it to Hubbard. "Go upstairs and give this to Sid. Tell her I want the usual and have our friends stateside move it into heavy rotation. Tell her I need a clone as well." Hubbard left, and Rapp turned his focus back to Zahir. "We're going to be listening to everything you say, and if at any time I'm not satisfied with your efforts, our deal is off." "Off?" "Off means you broke the deal and you're dead." "And what if I don't like this deal?" Rapp raised his pistol and pointed it at the man's face. "It's pretty simple. I blow your brains all over the floor right now, and you end up like those 4 guys over there." Rapp motioned toward the 4 bodyguards. "You're not giving me much of a choice." "And when you kidnap villagers and hold them for ransom, do you give them a choice?" Zahir stubbornly refused to respond. "I know you don't like this, Abdul, and the reason's pretty simple. You're a bully. You're used to pushing people around, threatening them and their families with violence to get what you want. Now you're the one being bullied, and you don't like it, and I don't give a shit. The only thing that's important is that you understand and accept our deal. Do you?" With the barrel of the gun in his face, Zahir knew he had only one option: to acquiesce. Later, when he was away from this madman, he could figure out a way to go back on the deal. "You have left me with no other choice." "Good. I'd shake your hand, but I know it wouldn't mean anything since you plan on fucking me over the first chance you get. So here's what we're going to do." Rapp grabbed his phone with his right hand, tapped a few icons, and then held it out to take a photo of Zahir. "Smile. This is for the poster I'm going to send out with a $50,000 bounty on your head." "But you said—" "Relax. I know what I said. If you come through with what I need, you'll be fine. I might even give you the 50 grand, but if I get even the slightest whiff that you're screwing with me, you're done. You have enough enemies as it is. If I put a bounty on your head, they'll be lining up to collect. Hell, it's probably cheaper than wasting a missile on your ass." Hubbard came back with Zahir's phone and gave it to him. He handed a plain black flip phone to Rapp. Rapp held it up and said, "This is how we're going to talk to each other. I'll be able to track you with both phones, but this is the one we'll use to communicate." Rapp gave him the phone. "I'm going to call you in 2 hours, and if you don't answer the phone, you're dead. If you answer the phone and tell me you haven't discovered anything, you're dead. Do you understand how this is going to work?" Zahir reluctantly stuffed the phone in his pocket and nodded. "What do I call you?" "Harry," Rapp said, giving him one of his aliases. "Now get out of here and find out what happened to Joe Rickman." Chapter 4. Bethesda, Maryland. Joel Wilson impatiently tapped the fingers of his right hand on his right thigh while he was driven through the dark streets of the sleepy Maryland neighborhood. It was a few hours before dawn, and the thought of waking his boss this early was less than appealing, but Wilson had learned the hard way that the stodgy old fool needed to be kept in the loop. It was becoming an increasing source of irritation for Wilson, whose unbridled energy did not often gel with the slower pace of Samuel Hargrave, the FBI's Executive Assistant Director for National Security. To those outside the Bureau, the job title meant little, but within the FBI, it was a position that had grown significantly in stature after 9/11. Hargrave was in charge of counterterrorism, counterintelligence, and the Directorate of Intelligence and Weapons of Mass Destruction. He dutifully reported to the top man at the FBI, and beyond that, he kept an extremely low profile, and demanded the same of his people, another sore spot with Wilson. In Wilson's succinct opinion, Hargrave was a relic from the FBI's Cold War days, a man who was no longer suited to handle the multiple threats of this faster-paced world. He reminded Wilson of that bushy-eyebrowed law professor in the movie The Paper Chase. He was a real pain in the butt who spent his life looking to catch the tiniest of mistakes while losing sight of the big picture. The man loved to point out every flaw, no matter how small. He was the most anal-retentive, crotchety jerk Wilson had ever worked for. If only the fool would drop dead of an aneurysm, Wilson could get on with saving the country from the various threats that were circling. Wilson believed that his job was the most difficult and demanding at the Bureau. He was the deputy director of counterintelligence, which meant that he, not the CIA, was the tip of the spear. It was simple. The biggest threats to the nation were the foreign intelligence agencies and terrorist organizations that were looking to attack and weaken America. It was Wilson's job to stop them and those Americans who might be aiding the enemy. Hargrave was everything a boss shouldn't be. He was an obstacle to every decision and operation that Wilson tried to launch. Wilson's frustration had grown to the point that he began to cut Hargrave out of the decision process, only to be severely reprimanded by the director of the FBI himself. It was the lowest point of Wilson's otherwise sterling 21-year career with the Bureau, and it couldn't have come at a worse time. Wilson's boss, the man who ran the counterintelligence division, had been on leave for 4 months after a back surgery that didn't go as planned. Wilson had been asked to step in and take over as acting director. It was one of the 3 most coveted jobs at the FBI, and Wilson didn't balk at the opportunity. He took over as if he'd been running the place for several years, and not long after that he ran afoul of Hargrave. Since then, Wilson had explored every conceivable avenue around the man, but he'd been stymied. As the director himself eventually told Wilson, the Federal Bureau of Investigation is big on chain of command for a reason. Wilson disagreed with them both, but he was not so bullheaded as to irritate the director again, so he kept Hargrave informed of his every decision, no matter how small. Wilson got the sense that Hargrave knew what he was up to, but so far the man had remained unflappable. Tonight's developments, however, might be enough to undo him. But for now, Wilson was once again forced to perform this stupid dance. That was why he was rolling along this beautiful tree-lined street in Chevy Chase when he should have been with the rest of his team boarding one of the Bureau's Gulfstream 550s for a jaunt halfway around the globe. The vehicle began to slow, and Wilson noticed his driver searching for the right address. "It's up there on the left," Wilson said. "The white Colonial with green shutters." Under his breath he added, "Boring, just like his personality." "Excuse me, sir?" the young agent asked. "Nothing," Wilson replied. Cal Patterson was in his 3rd year with the Bureau, and he considered himself a lucky man to be one of the youngest agents in the counterintelligence division. He liked his job, but his boss made him nervous. Patterson casually turned the wheel of the Ford Taurus and edged the sedan into the narrow drive. "Anything you'd like me to take care of while you're briefing the EAD, boss?" Wilson grabbed the handle and said, "Check in with the GO team. I want everyone on that plane and their gear stowed when we arrive. We should have been in the air an hour ago." "I'll let them know, sir." Wilson closed the car door and proceeded up the brick-lined walkway. He glanced through what looked like the dining room window and could see the faint glow of a light in what he presumed was the kitchen. The front stoop was small, enough for 2 people. Wilson reached out to press the doorbell and then caught himself. Probably better to knock at this hour. He held his left hand up to the door and rapped his knuckles twice on the green door. He waited a long moment and then heard the locking mechanism turn. The door cracked to reveal the high forehead of Samuel Hargrave. Without so much as a nod, Hargrave opened the door and motioned for Wilson to enter. The senior man closed the door and started down the center hallway to the back of the house. Wilson took in the black leather slippers, the black watch plaid pajama bottoms, and the navy blue robe. The man looked as if he'd stepped off the set of a Cary Grant movie. Wilson started to ponder what it was like to be born 50 years too late. But before he got too far, Hargrave asked him if he'd like a cup of coffee. "No, thank you. I've already had my fill, and I have a long flight ahead of me." Hargrave stared at him for a moment, dissecting the words, trying to decode the shaded message. He poured himself a cup of black coffee and sat at the small 4-person kitchen table. After a sip, he asked, "Long flight? Where are you headed?" "Afghanistan." Wilson offered nothing more. "Afghanistan is a big country. Any place in particular?" "Jalalabad." "Jalalabad," Hargrave mused. "I think this is a first." "A first?" Wilson frowned. "I don't understand, sir." Hargrave had told him to call him Sam 100 times. But Wilson still refused. It was a control thing, he knew, but Hargrave wasn't willing to make a big deal out of something so petty. Still, it was one more reason to worry that his acting director of counterintelligence was someone who needed close monitoring. If he played these kinds of games with him, what must he be like with his colleagues and subordinates? How were his convictions when it came to following the law? Hargrave had learned long ago that these little things could eventually spell big problems for the Bureau. In all the years I've been doing this, I've been pulled out of bed for a lot of reasons. But no one has ever told me they're flying to Jalalabad. Hargrave set his cup down and rubbed his eyes. We really have become a global law enforcement agency. No shit, you moron, Wilson thought. Where the hell have you been for the last decade? So why Jalalabad? Joe Rickman. Wilson had a bigger target in mind, but Rickman would do for now. Hargrave was familiar with the name. He'd heard some rumblings that the covert officer had become a bit of an obsession with Wilson. He could tell the temperamental Wilson was on edge, so he chose his words carefully. What has Mr. Rickman done now? I received a tip 3 hours ago that he was kidnapped from a safe house in Jalalabad. Hargrave did not speak for several moments. His mind was occupied with all of the ramifications of someone like Joe Rickman's falling into the hands of America's enemies. To say that the men and women at Langley would be distraught would be an understatement. Do you know who took him? No, but I find the timing suspect. Suspect? Hargrave asked with a curious tone. I have been investigating him for the past 2 months. Rickman, as well as a few others, but Hargrave didn't need to know that. Excuse me? Hargrave asked, not quite sure he'd heard right. Starting almost a year ago, I began to receive some disturbing information about Mr. Rickman. Accusations that he was siphoning off large amounts of money from his covert fund and that he was getting a little too close to some nefarious individuals. Hargrave closed his eyes and then held up his right hand. You've known about this for almost a year and didn't bring it to my attention? Wilson's back stiffened. It didn't warrant your attention, sir. It was nothing more than rumors to begin with. If I passed along every rumor that came into my office, I'd be running upstairs to meet with you 8 times a day. Hargrave could feel the pressure building and reminded himself that his doctors had warned him against getting too upset. Mr. Rickman, he said slowly, is a unique individual. Anything concerning him and his activities automatically rises to the top of the heap, so I don't accept your premise. I am very disappointed that you decided to keep this from me. Hargrave shook his head and added, We've been over this before. You were told by the director himself what was expected of you. Wilson had known this was how it would play out, and he was ready. I am sorry, sir, but there are some extenuating circumstances. Really? Yes. I'm listening. Wilson intentionally fidgeted in his chair. He wanted to convey the sense that he was taking all this very seriously. The information was originally passed on to me by a very important person who did not want their name connected to this in any way. Hargrave had started his career at the FBI, and then, at the age of 40, he was appointed to the U.S. Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. He had spent 11 years on the bench and knew how this game was played. And that person is? I'm afraid I can't say, sir. Wilson tried to appear stoic, although inside he took great joy in the fact that Hargrave's pale face had turned suddenly red. That is unacceptable. We sat in the director's office less than a month ago, and he specifically told you that you were to keep me involved in any investigations your office was handling. There was no gray area. Hargrave shook his head. The director is going to be very disappointed. I'm not sure you're going to be catching that flight to Jalalabad. Wilson had expected this and was prepared to take the right tack. Sir, there has been no investigation, just some very troubling accusations made by a very prominent player. I didn't feel it was right to bring any of this to your attention because, frankly, it was beneath you. Until I could figure out if these accusations were fact or fiction, I didn't want to give the matter any more life than it deserved. Hargrave dissected the words for a few seconds and said, Who is the power player who made the accusations? I'd rather not say, sir. I'm sure you wouldn't. But that's not how this works. I'm your boss. And if you want to fly to the other side of the world and spend taxpayer dollars investigating a fellow federal employee, you need to read me in on this." Wilson crossed his legs and made a great show of looking at the round clock on the wall. He sighed and offered, "The person in question is a senator, sir, and as part of our agreement he made me swear that his name would not be dragged into this." "How convenient." "I'm not making this up," Wilson said defensively. "It doesn't matter. If you want to get on that plane, you are going to tell me the name of this mystery senator." "Sir, I gave my word." "I'm losing my patience, Joel. I am your boss. This isn't the Cub Scouts, it's the FBI, and we have rules and laws that we are duty-bound to follow. A personal promise you made to a politician holds no water with us. You are going to tell me everything you know right now, or I will call Dulles and pull your flight plan, and then in about 4 hours I'll be having breakfast with the director, and I will brief him on your most recent activities. When I'm done, he will ask me for my recommendation as to your future as acting director of counterintelligence." Hargrave paused and stared at Wilson for an uncomfortably long moment. "Based on your refusal to follow the most simple of orders, I'm fairly certain my recommendation will be less than stellar." Wilson had been fairly certain this was how this little drama would play out. But in order to make it convincing, he had needed to follow his script. He blurted out the name. "Carl Ferris." Hargrave nearly choked. "You mean to tell me you launched an investigation based on innuendo from one of the biggest partisan hacks to ever serve in the United States Senate?" Wilson played dumb. "I have no opinion on the man, sir. When a sitting U.S. senator asks for a private meeting, I take it very seriously." "Good God, you fool," Hargrave said haltingly. "I don't believe for a second that you are that naive." Hargrave was on his feet pacing now, his brain struggling for a way to unwind this potential mess before it saw the light of day. Carl Ferris was a master manipulator of the media and the supposed facts they reported. Wilson offered an additional piece of information. "He told me you had it in for him." "Excuse me?" "Senator Ferris told me that you didn't like him. He wouldn't get into specifics, but he said it had something to do with your days on the FISA bench." Hargrave turned to Wilson and said, "The issue he is alluding to is sealed and not up for discussion, but I can tell you that the senator did not comport himself well." "I don't want to get in the middle of a pissing match between you two. What happened is none of my business." "There is no pissing match." Hargrave didn't like the way Wilson had turned this into a personal matter. "What's at issue here is that you have once again failed to keep me informed of what you are up to, and now you are about to get on a plane with one of my Go teams and insert yourself into an extremely delicate situation." Hargrave grabbed the back of one of the chairs and said, "Let me ask you something. Have you bothered to think of how our friends at the CIA are going to react when you show up and start sticking your nose in the middle of this mess? Personally, I couldn't care less what those Neanderthals at Langley think." Hargrave had encountered this type of behavior in others before, and he knew how destructive it could be. "We are on the same team," he said flatly. "And my job is to make sure we stay on the same team." "What is that supposed to mean?" "In my department, no one is above suspicion. My job is to stop the enemy from penetrating our national security apparatus, and the easiest way for the enemy to do that is to get one of our people to turn on us." "What are you implying?" "I'm implying nothing. The facts are that Joe Rickman is one of the darkest spooks this country has. He's a walking, breathing encyclopedia of things that are so wrong it's ridiculous. If he's been kidnapped, it's our duty to offer Langley our capable assistance, if for no other reason than that we need to get a handle on the breadth of the damage. We should be the coordinating agency because God knows Langley will want to admit only a fraction of the possible damage. We need a full accounting of our exposure." Hargrave didn't want to, but he had to concede the point. 6 months from now it might look very bad if he forced counter-espionage to sit this out. "I see where you're coming from. But I want you to play nice. I will be there to offer assistance in finding Rickman, and if along the way I see that any laws have been broken, I will consult you before I move my investigation in a new direction." "That's what I wanted to hear." Wilson smiled. There was no need to report his other concerns at this point. As Senator Ferris had already warned him, Hargrave wouldn't believe him anyway. Wilson stood, saying, "Thank you, sir. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get moving. One more thing, Joel. I want you to check in with me every day. I need to know what you're up to." "I was planning on it, sir." Hargrave walked Wilson to the door and watched him leave. He didn't believe for a second that Wilson was planning on keeping him informed, and he found it even less believable that Wilson was planning on simply aiding the CIA in finding Rickman. All things considered, though, he had to let him go. Rickman was a valuable asset, and the FBI needed to make sure the broader national security interests were being looked after. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else going on here. Something that Wilson was keeping from him. Chapter 5. Jalalabad, Afghanistan. Hubbard was clearly agitated. He'd gone over to the window to watch Zahir and his men leave. Rapp ignored him and took a moment to discuss something he wanted Coleman to follow up on. Rapp was just finishing his point when Hubbard approached them. Hubbard blinked several times and asked Rapp, "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" "I think so," Rapp replied calmly. "I'm not sure you do. That man is crazy." Hubbard pointed toward the door as if Zahir was still there. "I have to work with him. What in the hell were you thinking?" Rapp remained cool and said, "You can't bribe a guy like that. He'll screw you over in the end, every time. The only way to deal with a guy like Zahir is to make him fear for his life." Hubbard was incredulous. "Darren is going to flip when he finds out. He's worked nearly a year to bring Zahir back into the fold." At the mention of Sickles's first name, Rapp began to lose his grip. "Darren is an idiot. Idiot or not, he's my boss, and the agency's top guy here in Afghanistan. Are you done?" It was more of a warning than a question. "No, I'm not done. I'm far from done. You're going to be here for a week or two at the most, and then you'll head back to the States, and I'll have to deal with him. You don't know shit about Zahir. He's a ruthless son of a bitch. He's probably going to kill me." "Then kill him first," Rapp growled. Hubbard looked at Rapp as if he'd lost his mind. "Darren's his handler. I can't kill him." "I'll deal with Darren. In the meantime, you need to grow a set of balls. The way you let him walk in here and talk to you, what the hell is wrong with you? You work for the damn agency, Hub, not the State Department. Start acting like it, or find another job. Shit, you've got mercenaries, former Taliban, Northern Alliance, former Coalition, Special Forces. They're all hanging out looking to make a buck. You could have gone to Rick, given him 10 or 20 grand, and found 15 guys that'd be willing to shoot the prick in the head when he left his house in the morning." "It's not that easy." "Really?" Rapp asked, his jaw clenched with anger. "Well, then I must be frickin' Superman, because I've lost track of how many scumbags like Zahir I've plugged over the years. It's not fucking rocket science," Rapp said, poking Hubbard in the chest. "Darren would lose his mind," Hubbard said in his own defense. "I just told you I'll deal with Darren." Rapp couldn't wait to get his hands on the pencil-pushing prick. "Right now I need you to work every source you have, start shaking the trees, and find out what happened to Rick. And if you run into Zahir and he so much as looks at you the wrong way, I want you to call me. You understand?" Hubbard slowly nodded, knowing it was unwise to continue to push the point with Rapp. "Yeah, I'll get on it." "Good, and remember, we need to move fast." Rapp heard his name called from upstairs. He looked at the staircase and then back at Hubbard. He slapped the taller man on the shoulder and said, "Remember who we are, Hub. Don't take any crap, especially for the next 48 hours. If we don't get Rick back, Zahir is going to be the least of our problems." Hubbard moved toward the door. Coleman stood at Rapp's side, his .45 caliber H&K hanging loosely at his side. When the junior operative was gone, Coleman said, "I'm not sure he's cut out for this job." Rapp wasn't sure either, but he couldn't be mad at Hubbard. "If Darren Sickles had been my boss, God only knows how I would have turned out." Coleman kept his blue eyes focused on the door and said, "If Darren Sickles had been your boss, you would have killed him. Hell, Stan was your boss, and you almost killed him, and he's one tough bastard. Sickles is a pussy." Rapp thought of Stan Hurley, the man who had trained him. Pound for pound, Hurley was the toughest man Rapp had ever known. One mean son of a bitch. That was more than 20 years ago, though. More recently, Hurley had begun to show his age. His mind was still sharp as hell, but he was looking frail. "They don't make 'em like Stan anymore." Coleman cracked a smile. "They sure don't. But you're not too far off." Rapp feigned insult. "Are you trying to say I'm some crotchety, set-in-his-ways old man who drinks and smokes too much and still chases women like I'm in my 20s? You're more like him than you'll ever admit. If he was here, the two of you would have gotten in a fight over who got to stick a gun in that terrorist's face." Rapp laughed. "Yeah, and he would have won. And then he would have flown up to Kabul and done the same thing to Sickles." "Well, the day's far from over. I'd say there's a better than 50-50 chance you and Sickles will have it out." Rapp cursed under his breath. One more thing to deal with, he thought to himself. He heard his name called again and walked to the bottom of the stairs, stepping around the dead bodyguards. He looked up the flight of stairs and said, "What's up?" A brunette poked her head around the corner and said, "I think you should come up here. There's something you need to see." Rapp started up the stairs, keeping his feet near the wall so as to not step in the trail of smeared blood. Sidney Hayek was the newest member of Rapp's team, and it had been Kennedy's idea to have Hayek fill a vacant spot. Rapp had been less than enthused for several reasons. The first was pretty straightforward. His line of work didn't lend itself toward trusting people. The room for error was thin, and the stakes were so high that Rapp preferred running an op with an understaffed team over risking a new recruit who might get the entire team killed. The second reason for his apprehension was obvious. Hayek had come to them from the FBI. Rapp hit the top landing and asked, "What's up?" Like the rest of the team, Hayek was wearing an olive-drab field jacket, the pockets stuffed with the various tools of the trade. As directed by Rapp, she wore her flak jacket under her field jacket to draw less attention. She was also wearing a pair of jeans, a pair of Merrill hiking boots, and a blue Detroit Tigers baseball cap with a light and a small fiber-optic camera clipped to each side of the visor. She looked at Rapp with her almond eyes and asked, "Scott told you about the safe?" "Yeah, any sign of forced entry?" "No. I'm afraid it looks like it was opened by Mr. Rickman." Rapp frowned. "Let's not jump to any unfounded conclusions." Hayek shrugged. "I never met the man, but I assume he was the only person within a couple 1,000 miles who had the code." It was more like 7,000 miles, but Rapp didn't bother to correct her. Hayek had grown up in Detroit, the only daughter of Armenians who had emigrated from Lebanon. She was fluent in Arabic, and most important, she could walk down the streets of nearly any Middle Eastern city without anyone giving her a second glance. In response to her accusation, Rapp said, "He was the only one with the code." "Well, the safe was opened using the code. There was no tampering with the locking mechanism, and as best I can tell, it wasn't hacked." "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be after being here less than an hour." Rapp tried to picture how it had gone down. So he was forced to open the safe at gunpoint. "I didn't know the man, so I can't say." After working with her for 7 months, Rapp was starting to get a sense of how Hayek operated. It was more what she didn't say than what she said. "You have some concerns." "I always have concerns." "Share them." "Some things don't make sense." "Such as?" She hesitated and then said, "Come here and I'll show you." They started down the hall. "Careful where you step." Rapp looked down and stepped around a sizable pool of blood. That was when he noticed the splatter on the wall. "What's this?" Hayek looked over her shoulder. "One thing at a time. I want to show you the office first." She entered the room and walked behind the desk. There were no windows. The walls and ceiling were covered with acoustic foam, and the floor was covered with a series of rubber squares. Behind the desk, a narrow door covered in foam was open. Behind it was the open safe. "What am I looking for?" Rapp asked. "Nothing." Hayek turned off the lamp on the desk and then hit the UV light on her visor. She looked down at the floor in front of the safe and then expanded the area, sweeping the light back and forth. "No blood. Not a drop." "I still don't get it." "Come here." She walked across the room and stepped into the hallway. She hit the light switch and extinguished the hallway lights. The UV light on her visor lit up splotches and splatters of blood. "Lots of blood out here, but none in there. Now, I don't know Rickman, but I've heard he was a pretty serious man." "Your point?" "I've been around you long enough to guess that someone would have to beat you to a bloody pulp before you'd even think of opening that safe." Rapp nodded. "There's no blood in the office." "The rough stuff could have started anywhere. Down in the kitchen." Hayek shook her head. "And there would be blood in that office, even if it were just small traces, but there isn't any." Hayek's theory was slowly sinking in. "What else do you have?" "This mess." Hayek pointed at the blood on the wall. "Best guess is it belongs to one of the bodyguards downstairs." "The one missing half his face?" "Yeah." Hayek edged closer to the wall. She pointed at a gooey chunk. "I have samples of everything, and I'll be able to test them for verification when we get back stateside, but I'm 99% sure this is brain matter with a little bit of bone and blood, consistent with the gunshot wound received by John Doe number 4 downstairs." "And this should interest me how?" "Look at the pattern of the splatter." Hayek acted as if she was holding a gun. "The bodyguard would have been facing this way, toward the stairs. The person came up and shot him from behind. The bullet tore through his head, exited, leaving this large splatter on the wall, and then the bodyguard fell face down here. That's why there's the big pool of blood. Rapp studied the blood splatter on the wall. It all lined up. I agree. So what's your point? 3 of the 4 guards were shot in the face. Makes sense. They were reacting to the intrusion, going to meet the threat. This one, though, is shot in the back of the head. Doesn't make sense. He should have been shot over there at the top of the stairs, by the perps coming up the stairs. Rapp ignored her police talk. He was a little irritated with himself for not seeing it sooner. How closely did you look at the bodies downstairs? Close enough. Did you take measurements of the entrance wounds? Not exact, but I'm pretty confident that the first 3 men were shot by a 9mm. And you know that how? Hayek held up a Ziploc bag with 3 brass shell casings. I found these on the floor. And the 4th man? Hayek shook her head. I've looked all over this hallway, and the stairs, and I can't find the casing. Best guess on the caliber? Best guess? A .45, hollow point. Definitely not the same caliber that took out the other guys. Rapp ran all the information through his head, knew where it was taking him, but didn't want to go there even though he knew he had to. He looked back in the office. There was no sign of struggle, not a thing out of place. The hallway was a bloody mess. Rapp's eyes focused on the Rorschach-like splatter. I suppose the slug is buried in that wall. Yeah, I was going to dig it out, but I wanted to ask you first. I don't know this team coming in from Langley. Don't want to step on their toes. It would be a problem, but Rapp could deal with it. Dig it out as quick as you can. Anything else you need to tell me about? Hayek hesitated and then said, No. What is it? Nothing. She shook her head. I'll know more when I start matching up the blood samples with the bodies. I think we'll be able to get a pretty clear picture of where everyone was when this thing went down. Nice work, Sid. Do me a favor and keep this between the 2 of us. Until we know for certain, I don't want anyone running around peddling half-baked ideas. Anyone leans on you, send them to me. Understood? Kennedy had asked her to relay as much information as possible, as quickly as possible. Hayek could see that she was caught between her 2 bosses, but Rapp was just starting to trust her, so she said, Understood. Good, wrap things up and be ready to pull out in 10. What's the rush? There's a meeting back in Kabul, the whole alphabet soup. You hate those kinds of meetings. I hate any meeting, but especially this kind. Rapp thought of Sickles running the meeting without him. Why the man worked for the company was beyond Rapp's ability to comprehend. I need to make sure a certain idiot doesn't make this shit show any worse than it already is. Chapter 6. U.S. Embassy, Kabul, Afghanistan. I've never even heard of this man, the woman said with obvious frustration. Who the hell does he think he is? Colonel Hunter Poole took a final drag from his cigarette, then tossed it to the gravel and crushed it with the heel of his black jump boot. I don't know much about him, but you've heard of him. Poole knew he needed to be careful. Ariana Vinter was a passionate woman whose one glaring weakness was that she thought she could bully her way to any victory, and from what he'd heard about this Rapp fellow, it was probably not wise to attack him in a direct fashion. Poole shrugged and said, He's a spook. They don't exactly advertise their resumes. Vinter regarded her military man with a skeptical squint of her hazel eyes. You're holding back. Poole played it cool. I've heard a few things, the kind of stuff that doesn't make it into official reports. He lit another cigarette and said, He's notorious in certain circles. Notorious? How? Vinter asked, taking a deep pull off her thin menthol cigarette. Their liaisons had become increasingly common. The embassy was a crowded, cramped place, and smoking indoors by Americans was strictly forbidden, even in a country where virtually everyone smoked. And then there was the simple fact that they needed to be careful about their relationship, so they came to this corner of the compound where the multicolored shipping containers were stacked. It was the hinterlands, where the workers and the occasional jarhead came to replenish supplies, but never the higher-ups from the embassy. And Poole and Vinter were definitely higher-ups. Poole placed a hand against a rust-colored Connex container and thought about the various rumors regarding Mitch Rapp. The man, like Poole, was in his mid-40s. Unlike Rapp, however, Poole had a sterling record. He graduated in the top 5% of his class from West Point, completed Ranger School, and then blazed a trail through the Big Green Machine with stops at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He was a platoon leader in the First Gulf War, and by the time the Iraq campaign started, he was the company commander of Alpha Company, 2nd Ranger Battalion. He completed 3 combat tours with the Rangers, 2 in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. During his second tour in Afghanistan, he was serving as an intelligence officer on the Joint Special Operations Command staff when he heard his commanding officer tell a story about a CIA covert officer who had bluffed his way into a detention facility at the Bagram Air Base by impersonating a U.S. Air Force colonel from the Office of Special Investigations. A week earlier, 2 high-value Taliban commanders had been caught on the battlefield and thus far had refused to talk. In less than an hour, Rapp managed to get one of the men to spill the beans on an impending terrorist operation set to target the United States. The rumors about how he pulled this off were varied, but they all circled around some very Orwellian tactics that created a mix of awe and fear among the men at JSOC. There were other stories out there about Rapp, most of them from second- or third-hand accounts of his exploits in Indian country. If they were to be believed, Rapp was a person capable of extreme violence, with little concern for his own mortality and an absolute disregard for the political and legal issues that the men and women in uniform had to wrestle with. Poole had followed the rules as any smart West Pointer would, and he was now on the doorstep of receiving his first star, a lifelong dream. But that wasn't where it was going to end. Poole felt he had the right stuff. Shooting for the chairmanship of the Joint Chiefs was his ultimate goal, and if that worked out, who knew? Maybe even the Oval Office was a possibility. Up until recently, Poole would have found it difficult to understand a man like Rapp. Poole had been a rule follower, but Winter had opened his eyes to the reality of Washington. She had shown him that there were times where rules were senseless obstacles. Rapp appeared to have built his entire career and reputation on the same philosophy. As enticing as it was to cut corners, Poole knew he needed to be careful. The U.S. Army was an entirely different playground. One misstep in the eyes of the wrong general, and your career was over. It was the fear of just that kind of misstep that caused Poole to temper what he knew about Rapp. It's not easy to separate fact from fiction where he's concerned, but if you believe even half of what is said about him, he's an extremely reckless individual. The kind of man that could sink my career, Poole thought to himself. Damn it! Winter flicked her cigarette into the side of the container, sparks cascading to the ground. The last thing we need right now is some brute from the CIA screwing us up. I've worked way too hard. Winter thought of her career at the State Department and all of the sacrifices she'd made to climb the ladder alongside all of the other scheming and plotting diplomats. She'd taken this god-awful posting in Afghanistan for multiple, complicated reasons, and one very simple one, because it would further her career. Winter hated Afghanistan. It was a country filled with people who were stuck in some ancient misogynistic culture that should have died a century ago. The place was filled with hocus-pocus religious fanatics who had less respect for women than most men had for their dogs. As much as it bothered Winter that a bunch of bearded freaks could terrorize women with impunity while the U.S. government stood by, her boss had made it clear that there were other priorities. The orders had come from the White House that with the election bearing down on the administration, they needed to accelerate the military withdrawal. The administration was looking for an excuse, any excuse, that would satisfy the independent voters. For several years, Winter had been pushing reintegration as a solution. The original term had been amnesty, but it didn't poll well, so she came up with something more benign. After multiple focus groups and $125,000 to one of K Street's top PR firms, they landed on reintegration. The word had a more clinical sound to it, but more important, it would pave the way for exit and victory. It was one of those rare moments in Winter's career when her genius had led to something that she didn't want. It had been nearly a year ago when the Secretary of State's assistant told her to come on up to the palatial office for a very important meeting. It started out well enough. The Secretary told her the President loved her idea. Winter had beamed with pride, like a child finally receiving due recognition from a distant parent. And then came the bad part. The President wanted her to take the lead, run with her idea, and make sure it got implemented. Her boss told her, "The President wants you on the ground in Kabul, supervising the entire operation. You report directly to me. We're putting a lot of power in your hands. The ambassador will be told to aid you in any way you need, and the White House is prepared to lean very heavily on the Pentagon and the CIA to make sure they support you. For all intents and purposes, you will be running the show in Afghanistan." Winter didn't really hear the rest of it. Her mind hung up on the part about living in Kabul, as if it were some bone-jarring pothole in an otherwise smooth road. Winter had traveled to Afghanistan on multiple occasions, and she had long ago decided that she detested the place. But this was a career maker. She knew almost immediately that if she did her year or two in hell, she could demand any post she wanted afterward. Her husband wasn't thrilled that she had failed to consult him on the decision, but she knew he wouldn't have the balls to really stand up to her. And besides, her teenage son was driving her nuts. There was too much testosterone in the house for her liking. She rationalized that it might be the best thing for her to take a break from the two men in her life, and if it caused her marriage to fall apart, that was something she could deal with. After 17 years, change might not be the worst thing. "He's a small cog in an extremely big wheel," Poole said, trying to calm her down. Winter was an extremely intelligent and passionate woman, but she could handle only one passion at a time, and Poole was more interested in getting her to hike up her skirt at the moment. He reached out and placed his right hand on her shoulder. "One call to the secretary and you can have him shipped off to Antarctica." He started rubbing her shoulder. Winter turned that possibility over in her mind until she figured out that her little army boy was a little too earnest in his physical contact. "What in the hell are you doing?" "I'm trying to help you relax. You don't think clearly when you get like this." "And you don't think clearly when you let your dick do your thinking. I've seen that look in your eye before. You're not worried about me thinking clearly. You're focused on having sex." Winter saw the playful grin on Poole's face. "It's only been, 6 weeks? And I already have you figured out. There will be no screwing back here between the storage containers like a couple of dogs in heat. It happened once. It is a moment of weakness, and it will never happen again." "Come on," Poole half moaned. He pulled her close, adding, "I need you." "You had me 2 days ago. I don't think you need it that bad." "Normally I'm not like this, but you make me crazy." He kissed her lips while his hands found her backside. Winter pushed him away. "We have a meeting in 10 minutes. Snap out of it. Zahar is threatening to take his men and go back to the mountains. If that happens, it could create a domino effect, and all of the progress I've achieved over the past year will vanish, all because some spook got kidnapped." She thought about the strange turn of events. "I hear this mercenary who is trying to undo all of our hard work is going to show his face at the meeting." Poole pulled Winter's hand toward his crotch. "Speaking of hard..." Winter almost slapped him. "Stop it. We need to focus. Darren is absolutely beside himself. He says this Rapp has serious mental issues. Do you know what Washington will do if they hear we screwed this up?" Poole had finally got it through his head that they weren't going to have sex. He took a deep sigh. "You're making way too big of a deal out of this. We didn't screw anything up. We're on schedule with reintegration. If this thing goes off the tracks at this point, we blame it on Rapp. We lay it at the feet of the CIA and get out of the way." "That doesn't work for me. I don't fail." Winter stabbed herself in the chest with her index finger, attempting to add some unneeded emphasis to her position. Her hazel eyes wild with fury, she added, "I'm not going back to D.C., a fucking disaster." Poole sighed. It appeared that a confrontation was unavoidable. He wondered if there was any way to minimize the oncoming clash. Winter would expect 100% support from him, but Poole had already decided it would be foolish to confront Rapp in such an open way. Poole had learned that when going into battle against an unknown enemy, you must set your ego aside and have a contingency in place for a tactical withdrawal. That was the careful course he would have to navigate. Winter would scream at him later, but even with the great sex, he was growing tired of her browbeatings. Maybe this would present an opportunity to balance the scales and make her more compliant. "I'm going to support you, but I'm warning you, he might not be the kind of guy you want to pick a fight with." "Well, I'm not the kind of woman you want to pick a fight with. And it's not going to be a fight. I'm going to tear his balls off and send him packing, and that's going to be the end of it." As much as Poole wanted to believe her, he shared none of her confidence. "Ariana, I know I'm not going to be able to change your mind, but don't tell me I didn't warn you." Having no desire to hear her response, Poole turned and began making his way toward the main building. Chapter 7. Inter-Services Intelligence, Headquarters, Islamabad, Pakistan. Nadima Shan walked down the broad hallway with a sense of dread. After 29 years of working for Pakistani intelligence, one would think Shan would be used to these bumps in the road. But this particular bump concerned him for reasons that he was extremely reluctant to share with anyone else in the building. Shan was an expert navigator when it came to the turbulent waters of the ISI, and that historical knowledge only added to his growing concern. The place was not some monolithic bureaucracy where like-minded men shaped the intelligence gathering and covert activities of Pakistan. The ISI was a deeply divided, sectarian institution composed of intelligence professionals and military personnel who had vastly different ideas about what was best for their country. The main fault line lay between the secularists and the religious fanatics, with various groups within each camp. The secularists typically pushed for modernity and stability. They had warned for years that the intelligence agencies' support of the Taliban in Afghanistan and Lashkar-e-Taiba in Kashmir, India, would eventually bite them in their proverbial behind. The religious fanatics saw the Taliban as an ally that could be used to keep neighboring Afghanistan weak, and the fiercely nationalistic element of the group refused to waver in their support for the terrorists in Kashmir. Their hatred for India ran so deep that they blindly supported the savages who intentionally killed civilians in an effort to make Kashmir a free state. The hardliners were exposed as reckless fools in the aftermath of the Mumbai terrorist attacks that left 195 dead and the world-famous Taj Hotel a smoldering ruin. The international outcry was deafening. As the Deputy General for Analysis and Foreign Relations, Shan heard it the loudest. Even before the attacks on New York and Washington, Shan had had a very close relationship with the CIA and MI5. After those attacks, Shan began to see just how dangerous it was to support the mongrel dogs of jihad. Even President Musharraf began to see the light, and when he moved to support the United States in the war on terror, those dogs turned on him and tried unsuccessfully to take his life 7 times during his tenure as Pakistan's head of state. Only 5 of those incidents had been reported. Shan and his colleagues at ISI helped cover up the other 2 due to the conspirators' ties to certain intelligence officials. All of these incidents were embarrassing for the ISI, but none of them compared to what was uncovered when the Americans sent in one of their elite commando units to kill the world's most notorious terrorist. Bin Laden, it turned out, had been hiding in Pakistan for years. Shan instantly knew that factions within the ISI had been harboring him. Money would have changed hands, to be sure, but the primary motivation was undoubtedly ideological symmetry. No matter how Pakistan tried to deny it, there were a significant number of men in the Pakistani military and ISI who supported and applauded the actions of the Taliban and al-Qaeda. Shan was on his way to see just such an individual. Lieutenant General Akhtar Durrani was the Deputy General of the ISI's external wing. Durrani and Shan ran 2 of the ISI's 3 main groups. Their influence was vast, and they both reported directly to the ISI's Director General. Shan managed to move back and forth between the secularists and the hardliners, depending on the situation, while Durrani was firmly in the camp of the hardliners. Shan's pragmatism was driven by an obvious fact. Pakistan was overwhelmingly a Muslim country. Shan moved past the hand-picked military bodyguards and his colleague's male personal assistant with nothing more than a nod. ISI headquarters was a sprawling compound, and the Foreign Relations wing was a healthy distance from the offices of the external wing, but even so, the 2 deputy generals were very close. Almost every day, Shan made the lengthy walk from his office to Durrani's. Unlike most of the Pakistani men his age, Shan was very focused on his health. Neither of his parents had made it to 60. His father died of a heart attack brought on by years of smoking cigarettes, and his mother died of lung cancer brought on by years of smoking. Shan abhorred smoking and made every effort to eat right and walk every day. He was intent on living well into his 80s. The heavy door to Durrani's office was closed. Shan glanced over his shoulder at the assistant who checked the lights on his phone. "He's alone." Shan knocked on the door and turned the knob. He stepped into the large rectangular office and was enveloped in a haze of grey smoke. Shan didn't hesitate. He flipped a switch on the wall, and the hum of an exhaust fan kicked in. He had had the unit installed nearly 4 years ago because he could no longer tolerate sitting in the smoke-filled office. He considered chastising his friend for not having it on, but thought better of it. The man was breathing the carcinogens directly into his lungs. The exhaust fan would make little difference. "Nadim," Durrani said, leaning back in his high-back, black leather chair. "What a pleasure." Durrani was dressed in his army uniform, lest anyone forget the duality of his importance. Ashan, having served only 4 years in the Air Force, was dressed in a blue suit and yellow tie. "I was in the neighborhood and I decided to stop by." "Exercising again," Durrani smiled and held out his cigarette. "I've warned you, if you keep that up, it will kill you." "Yes, I know. If only I smoked like you and the rest of the country, I would be much healthier." "You might have more fun," Durrani said, with a broad grin forming under the ample black mustache that seemed to be a prerequisite for being an officer in the Pakistan military. "I have plenty of fun." Ashan continued past the 2 chairs in front of his friend's large desk and sat in the chair by the window that looked out onto one of the many inner courtyards of the compound. The armchair was something else he had ordered on his own. The 2 chairs in front of Durrani's desk were stubby little things that forced the occupants to look up at Durrani as if he sat high atop K2. Ashan couldn't be certain, but he suspected that the seating arrangement was a holdover from the old colonial days when British officers ran their country. "So what brings you to my little enclave this morning? Do you need the dirty tricks of the external wing to save your rear end once again?" More serious than kidding, Ashan said, "Your dirty tricks are usually what puts my posterior into the hot water." "Oh, come now," Durrani said with a deep laugh. "We all have our roles to play." Ashan was not in such a playful mood. He knew his friend too well, knew his capabilities and his weaknesses, and if he had been stupid enough to lend any of his people or expertise to facilitate the lunacy in Jalalabad, then they were all in a great deal of trouble. "Let us just pray for a moment that no one in the external wing had anything to do with what happened across the border last night." "Which border are you referring to?" Ashan ran a hand across his clean-shaven face and tried to gauge whether his old friend's ignorance was real or feigned. The man had become so adept at playing this game that Ashan could no longer tell the difference. He decided to play it straight. "The border to our north." "Ah, Mr. Rickman. Very unfortunate. I'm surprised you have heard." Ashan was used to the constant shots at the capabilities of his department. "Foreign relations is our specialty." "How did you learn of it?" "The embassy. They sent a cable this morning." Ashan told only half the truth. He'd also spoken with the CIA directly. "The Americans are very upset." "I would imagine they are. Mr. Rickman is not someone I would want to lose." Ashan turned and glanced out the window. He sensed his friend was playing some kind of game, but he could no longer be sure. They had met 35 years ago while he was studying at Oxford, and Durrani was at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. Back then Durrani was an open book, transparent about his passions and plans. Ashan had always appreciated his honesty and forthright manner. The ISI had slowly turned him into a duplicitous spy master, however, and Ashan feared there was an ever-deepening divide between them. "Akhtar, I have to ask you something." Durrani gave a welcoming smile, signaling for his friend to proceed. "You will not like this question." "People ask me questions every day that I do not like. It is part of my job." Ashan watched him light another cigarette and then casually asked, "Do you or any of your people have any information about the kidnapping of Rickman?" Durrani didn't answer right away, as he was taking in a deep breath of smoke to make sure the cigarette stayed lit. Only fools had to relight a cigarette. He shook his head and exhaled, saying, "That is a pretty broad question. Could you be more specific?" "Do you have any knowledge that he was a target?" "Personally, I had no knowledge." "And your people?" Durrani scoffed. "Why would my people be involved in something so reckless?" Ashan could come up with a half-dozen reasons that would make his point. He was going to let it go, and then something pushed him further than he had gone with his friend in some time. "Maybe you should tell me, since we both know some of your people decided it was a good idea to hide bin Laden from the world. In our own backyard, I should add." Durrani's easy expression hardened. "It has been decided that we are not to discuss that matter." Yes, it had been decided. In the embarrassing aftermath of the SEAL team raid, The President and the Director General had asked Ashan to investigate any potential involvement by the ISI in aiding bin Laden. A 2-star Army general had been ordered to investigate the potential involvement of the armed forces as well. The general had come back with a pathetic report that cleared the military of all involvement. Ashan's investigation was an entirely different matter. 6 intelligence officers were implicated, as well as 5 Army officers and a handful of subordinates. And there were more. Before Ashan could finish his investigation, the Director General stepped in and seized all evidence and had it destroyed. Ashan had been furious, but he was told it was for the good of Pakistan. The Director General told him the Americans had penetrated his investigation and were now in possession of information that they could use to blackmail Pakistan into doing their bidding. Ashan knew the answer was a complete fabrication. His investigation was taking him to the doorsteps of some very influential people. He was on the brink of exposing to the world that senior Pakistani officials had harbored the world's most notorious terrorist. Rather than clean house and admit their mistakes, the President and his senior cabinet members decided to bury the entire matter. Not a single person was punished, and since firing those involved might bring about more speculation, they were allowed to stay in their positions. Ashan found the entire thing infuriating, but was left with no recourse except one. He very quietly and carefully passed what he knew on to the Americans. Yes, it has been decided that we are not to discuss the matter, but we have always prided ourselves on being realists, and since we are in your office, which we both know to be secure, I see no harm in pointing out that we know for a fact that some of your people are indeed reckless. Don't be so smug. Your department was implicated as well. Yes, Ashan nodded. One reckless moron, and I have done my best to make his life miserable. I have him stuffed down in one of the sub-levels, digitizing old files. And the 5 men in your department, how are they faring? How I run my department is my business. Ashan took the defensive answer for what it was, an admission that the duplicitous scum still held their old positions. So now that we've established that we have people in our fine organization who would indeed participate in a plan as reckless as kidnapping someone like Joe Rickman, how do you suggest we make sure that none of our people had anything to do with this? I would suggest doing nothing. Nothing. Even investigating such a thing will draw the attention of the Americans. I see no reason to open my wing up to more of their accusations when I am confident that my people had nothing to do with this. Afghanistan is a rough place, as the Americans have found out. They should have gone home a long time ago. Ashan made no attempt to conceal his exasperation. Why must you continue to treat the Americans as if they are our enemy? Durrani stabbed out his cigarette in the large copper ashtray and folded his hands across his tight green uniform shirt. Afghanistan is our toy. The British thought it was their toy for a long time. And then the Russians thought they could take it, and then the Americans in their arrogance thought they could do what neither the British nor the Russians could accomplish. They thought they could tame the savages and take what is ours. Ashan shook his head. He had heard all of this before. Again, you have conveniently left out the part where Al-Qaeda attacked them. We could have handled Al-Qaeda for them. All they had to do was ask. They didn't need to invade our neighbor. Look at all the damage they have caused. Ashan started to speak and then stopped. It was all a waste of his time. They'd been over all of this before. Durrani loved to feign ignorance and spout his dislike for the Americans, all while gladly taking their money. It was rumored that he'd pocketed millions over the course of the war, some of it undoubtedly coming directly from Rickman. Ashan had been on the verge of leveling the accusation on multiple occasions, but had always maintained just enough control to avoid suicide. Durrani wasn't the only one who took money. Most of the leadership at the ISI received some form of payment from the Americans, including Ashan himself. The problem with Durrani was that he took the money and then worked feverishly to undermine the legitimate goals of their ally. The damage they have caused? And I suppose you think we've had no hand in this mess, training and funding the Mujahideen and then the Taliban and even some members of Al-Qaeda. Afghanistan is a mess, but it is our mess. It is time for the Americans to leave. And what do you think they're trying to do? This reintegration program that I've been helping them with is so they can pull out and maintain a network of paid spies to continue to manipulate the affairs of this region. Durrani shook his head. It is unacceptable. It is understandable considering everything they've been through. Would they allow us to meddle in the affairs of countries in their geographical sphere of influence? Durrani didn't wait for an answer. They most certainly wouldn't. They have worn out their welcome. It is time for them to go home. Increasingly, this was how their conversations played out. To push further would be a waste of time and energy. And what about Rickman? The general shrugged. Another casualty of war. Everyone involved in this mess has lost thousands. Rickman is just another body. Ashan shook his head in genuine disbelief. That's where you're wrong. Joe Rickman is not just another body. He is one of the CIA's most important assets. And they are not just going to sit back while he's tortured. The man has too many secrets. Extremely valuable secrets. You are overstating his importance. And even if you weren't, good luck finding him. Overstating his importance? Ashan stood and walked to the other side of the large desk. He faced his friend and said, Do you know who the Americans have dispatched to find Rickman? I have no idea. Ashan placed both hands on the desk and said, Your old friend, Mitch Rapp. Durrani looked away and swallowed hard. After a moment of silence, he said, We will offer him any assistance he needs. The words were flat, with no real commitment behind them. Akhtar, we have been friends for a long time. I don't want you to react. I don't want you to say a word. For once, please, listen to me. Mitch Rapp is an extremely dangerous man. The fact that they have sent him over here is proof of how serious the Americans are about getting Rickman back. Rapp doesn't care about diplomacy or politics. He is the last man you want to cross. He will kill anyone who has anything to do with this. I'm going to leave now, but I suggest you follow through on your words. Offer him any assistance he needs, and if you find out that any of your people have aided the Taliban in, we have no idea who did this, Durrani said, with more than a tinge of irritation in his voice. You are correct, Ashan said in a soothing voice, but we can make some educated guesses. And if the usual suspects are involved, we can almost guarantee that somewhere someone has a connection to the ISI. We need to put our people to work. They need to tell us what they find out, and we need to hand it over to the Americans. I know this is painful for you, but you need to act like a true ally. Durrani looked as if he'd taken a bite out of a sour lemon. I am sick of the Americans and their arrogance. This is not my problem. They can find Rickman on their own. Ashan stepped back. Fine, you stubborn fool. Rapp has already warned you what he would do to you if you stabbed him in the back again. He retreated toward the door and asked, Does he strike you as a man who doesn't follow through on his threats? I am not afraid of Mitch Rapp. Ashan placed his hand on the doorknob, a genuine feeling of sadness in his heart. His friend had turned into a stubborn old fool who thought the Americans lacked the resolve to play this nasty game at his ruthless level. For the average American he had a point, but Mitch Rapp was in no way average. Ashan opened the door, and over his shoulder said, If you aren't afraid of Mr. Rapp, then you need to have your head examined. Chapter 8. Kabul, Afghanistan. Rapp looked out the porthole of the enormous MRAP Cougar. The drive from the airport to the embassy was short, just under 2 miles. The Army Corps of Engineers had done a nice job widening the Great Massoud Road to relieve as many choke points as possible. Cameras had been installed, and fresh blacktop prevented insurgents from trying to bury roadside bombs. No parking was permitted on the street, and the sidewalks were kept clear of garbage, vendors, and pretty much anything that could conceal a roadside bomb. Despite all of these precautions, Rapp was filled with anxiety. While most people found comfort in the mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, Rapp thought of them as big rolling coffins. You might as well paint a sign on the hulking side that said infidels. Rapp preferred a more low-profile form of transportation. The clandestine service at Langley bought older model vehicles and had private contractors make sure the cars were in top mechanical shape. Occasionally, they would add bulletproof glass and some armor, but in Afghanistan, Rapp felt the key was to change vehicles often and blend in. As they hit the big turnaround at the corner of the embassy, Rapp felt his chest tighten. They were close to the gate, and this was where the crazies liked to attack. The vehicle came to a sudden stop. They were the third in a three-vehicle convoy. Rapp looked up at Coleman with irritation washed across his face and asked, "Why are we stopping?" Coleman gave him an easy shrug. "Probably checking our creds." "You mean to tell me those dumbasses didn't pre-clear us?" "No idea." Coleman smiled, amused at Rapp's nervousness. Rapp punched the button to lower the back hatch. "Well, I'm not going to be a sitting duck." As the stairs lowered, Rapp nimbly navigated them before they were all the way down. Coleman laughed at him and popped the button to close the hatch. The Air Force security guys driving the vehicle were grumbling up front, wanting to know who the moron was who had just compromised their secure vehicle. Coleman waved them off and apologized. Outside, Rapp came face to face with a U.S. Marine who couldn't have been older than 20. The corporal gave Rapp a knowing nod and said, "I don't like those things either." Rapp took a quick look around and realized the Marine was part of a security team that had been pushed out 100 feet from the main gate. They were in a semicircle spaced every 30 feet, a loose cordon designed to create a secure pocket while credentials were verified and vehicles checked. The embassy's perimeter blast walls, ballistic glass, and Kevlar-reinforced walls were impervious to car bombs, but visitors were vulnerable during this brief window when they were at the embassy's doorstep. 2 four-man fire teams composed the extended security. What a shitty job, Rapp thought to himself. They were a thin tripwire out here to slow down any crazy bastards who were barreling down on the gate in an explosives-laden vehicle. Their early shots with their M4s were not likely to stop the vehicle, nor were the rounds of the M249 saw. It was the job of the big 50-caliber guns back at the gate to punch a hole in the engine of any unauthorized vehicle. "How'd you end up with this powder puff job?" Rapp asked as his eyes continued to sweep the area. The Marine tapped the 2 chevrons on his sleeve. "Shit rolls downhill, and as my gunny likes to remind me, the Corps isn't a democracy, so I do what I'm told." Rapp nodded, understood it was the way it had to be. "Good luck." Rapp turned and headed for the door next to the big steel gate. A sergeant in his tan combat utility uniform and decked out in body armor intercepted him. Rapp pulled out a set of fake State Department credentials. The sergeant took the credentials and said, "Wait here." He walked over to the closest guard booth and slid the identification through the metal box. A few moments later he returned with Rapp's fake creds and a badge. "Are you armed, Mr. Cox?" Rapp shook his head and said, "Nope," even though he was carrying 2 pistols and a knife. He followed the sergeant to the small door and stepped through. On the other side, a familiar face was waiting for him. Rapp was neither pleased nor bothered to see Mike Nash. Irene decided to send over reinforcements. Nash had been attached to Rapp's team for almost 5 years and had recently been promoted to deputy director of the counterterrorism center at Langley. "I'm only the first wave. She's pulling in clandestine boys from all over the place." Rapp grimaced. He didn't have the time or the patience to manage all of these people. It quickly dawned on him that he wouldn't have to. That was why Nash was here. Still, he needed to have a say in what these people would be doing, or they'd end up falling all over each other. "And what are we going to do with everyone?" Nash shrugged. "They're going to beat the bushes until we find something more specific." Normally, Rapp would have been drastically against drawing too much attention to what they were doing, but this little disaster was a unique problem. Beating the bushes was as good a start as any for the moment. "Any orders?" Rapp asked, knowing there would be. "Yeah," Nash said as he jerked his head toward a tree-lined walkway, signaling Rapp to follow him. The 2 men looked enough alike to be confused as brothers. Rapp was 5 years older and an inch taller. His hair was black, with a touch of gray where Nash's was dark brown. The main similarities were in their square jaws and overall demeanor. When they were a good distance away from the gate, Nash found a spot under a towering cypress tree. "What did you find out in Jalalabad?" 4 dead bodyguards. Safe's empty, his laptop is gone, and God only knows what else. It's a fucking disaster." "Any leads?" "Not really." Rapp shook his head. "Although I met some asshole named Zahir. He used to be a terrorist, but now he's supposedly our friend." Rapp's tone made it obvious that he didn't buy the last part.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.